one thing I've noticed a lot of lately in the Facebook groups and the M37 forum and so on, a lot of people don't seem to have much idea how to actually troubleshoot these older vehicles. So I'll try to help you guys out here a little bit. So we're just going to assume that say you were happily driving down the road in your M37 and then she just died on you. So the truck was running okay. So the first thing you're going to want to do, make sure you're in the clear. Hopefully you've got enough momentum so that you could pull over to the side of the road. If you don't, you can always put your truck into second gear and run the starter, and you can drive the truck with the starter motor off of the road if you have to. The 24 volt starter is very powerful. It's very forgiving. It'll handle that no problem. I've done it many times over the years. So that's an option. And the second thing you're going to want to do after your truck has died, just make sure that you have your ignition off. You want to make sure you turn the ignition off right away. A lot of people will forget the ignition switch on when their truck has died because you're not thinking about turning the ignition off when your engine is already stopped, right? And what will happen if you leave that switch on, it'll burn out your points or fry your coil, and you'll have even more problems. And of course somebody's going to say, oh, I run Pertronics, so I don't have to worry about that. But guess what? It'll burn out your Pertronics unit too, and then you're down not only an expensive coil, but also an expensive Pertronics unit. So just make sure you turn your switch off, please. It'll save you all kinds of grief. So obviously the first thing you're going to want to look at is your fuel. Did you remember to gas up? And one thing you should know about these trucks, they tend to run out of gas with quite a bit of fuel left in the tank for some reason. I think that there's a flaw in the design of the fuel pickup or something. But they'll quite often run out of gas with a quarter of a tank left. And that's something to watch out for. So if that's the case, if you're simply out of gas, then hopefully you have your 5-gallon jerry can on the fender full. Put that in, start her up, and away you go. Now, if that wasn't the issue, we're just going to go over here. And so the first thing you're probably going to want to do is just make sure that your engine was getting fuel. So what you're going to do is take the 7/16 wrench that hopefully you carry in your pocket, and you put it on this. There's a little drain plug here. Get yourself a little container and take this plug out, and that'll tell you if there was fuel in your float bowl. And obviously if there was no fuel in your float bowl, then there's something going wrong here why you weren't getting fuel. So on this particular truck, I've put this fuel filter in line so you can actually see if there's fuel in that filter, which means the pump was sucking fuel up from the tank. I highly recommend you do a similar thing. Have this. It'll save you a lot of fiddling with your troubleshooting. And there's also a manually operated lever on the fuel pump. You can pump fuel. What will sometimes happen with these is that the float needle will stick. You can give that a tap with a wrench and see if it fills the carburetor up. So let's just assume now that you did have fuel there. So that means you can pretty much rule out the fuel system, so you can move on to ignition. So you can go over to this side of the truck, and what I always do is I keep these. As you can see, I can turn that with my thumb and my finger. There's no need to have these socked down super tight with a wrench. You just want them on there hand tight. So you would take that off and hold the end of the wire away from this head bolt. Turn your ignition switch on. Make sure your truck is out of gear, obviously, because you don't want to run over yourself. But you can reach down here and pull on the starter switch, and then you can see if you have spark. You should have about 1/4 of an inch or more of spark jumping, and the spark should be blue or white. Like, it should be white actually. It should be white from bluish white. But if your spark is orange, that would indicate that your coil is failing. If you have almost no spark, then you can kind of narrow that down to your points. If you have spark, but the spark is erratic, then you can start looking at the distributor cap. So you should always have a screwdriver on hand, because you need 6 screws removed to open up the distributor. It doesn't take very long. I only have 2 in this one right now, because whenever I just recently set the points up, and I've learned a long time ago to only put it down with 2 screws until you make sure that everything is working properly, because I have in the past left the rotor sitting on top of the voltage regulator and then realized that it was there after I put the 6th screw in. So you want to check, make sure that you have spark. You make sure you have power getting to your points. If you don't have power getting to your points, the number 12 wire is what you want to look at. And you can see it clips into a little holder here. You can just detach that, and you can take that off, and then you can turn your ignition switch on and see if you have power coming to the number 12 wire. If you don't have power going to that, then it's probably your ignition switch. These the older M series ignition switches with the Douglas connectors do tend to fail over time. They kind of almost explode internally. Moisture gets into them, and then they swell up, and then just all of a sudden one day they stop working. One thing, usually if your truck just kind of turns off, that would lean you to look toward the ignition right away. But that's not always the case, because some of these trucks, when they run out of gas, they act just like somebody turned the ignition switch off. No sputtering or anything. This particular truck gives you plenty of warning. It starts to buck and shudder and backfire and whatever, and you can generally nurse it quite a way to get it off the road. But my 1951, with the same engine and same ignition system, same everything, when that truck ran out of gas, it would just die on you, just like you turned the switch off. So if you have spark and everything, well, all you really need for these engines to run is air, fuel, and spark. So quite often you'll see people will say, oh, the condenser, that's what's caused the problem. But these trucks will actually run with the condenser right out of the system. They just won't run for very long because the points will burn up. I have my parts truck fired right up and ran quite happily with the condenser wire rotted right off, even though the points were burning up. So she started and ran good, but the points were definitely going fast. And sometimes you'll also hear people say that, oh yeah, the timing chain stretched and it skipped a tooth. Well, these engines can't really do that because there's so little space. There's only about this much space between the 2 timing gears. And if the chain were to stretch that much to allow it to skip a tooth, it would the chain would have been clattering on your the timing chain cover and worn a hole through it long before it got to that point. So there's really no reason why you can't get this truck back on the road when it breaks down. If you carry your spare parts, I carry spare rotor, spare cap, a spare coil, spare points, a spare condenser, feeler gauge for setting the points. You want to set the points to 018 to 022. I usually set them around 020. A lot of people say use a matchbook to set them. I wouldn't do that because I've actually measured a lot of matchbooks and I never found any of them that came anywhere close to what the points are supposed to be. So make sure you keep a feeler gauge on board with you. And we'll just take a look at the spare distributor cap that I have. I'll show you a few things with, don't mind the cobwebs, but see, this is how the distributor cap is on these trucks. This spring actually goes into the coil, because the coil is inside the distributor. Sometimes on some of the newer caps, that spring isn't long enough and it just barely makes contact, and that'll lead to your coil burning up. You want to look inside, see if you have any carbon tracks in there. This one had a carbon track in it, that's why it's been taken out of service. I think you can't really see it anymore, it's been sitting for too long. But sometimes if you get a carbon track and you don't have a spare distributor cap, you can sometimes scrape the carbon out of it, and then that'll get you home, and then you can replace the cap when you can. Sometimes you'll get little cracks on this tail here, which will create carbon tracks, and that causes all sorts of strange issues that were hard to track down. It's only happened once, but obviously it's something that can happen. And on my M38A1, I lost one cylinder suddenly, and one tower was completely covered with little cracks. For some reason it just suddenly formed. I suspect that was probably from just using a really old distributor cap. But yeah, it's definitely worthwhile to keep an extra one. This is some kind of Chinese replacement. It's a lot heavier than the original cap. And these black caps were not very good. I had nothing but problems with these. I ended up actually tossing them. No, that's what the problem was with this one. It was actually cast out of round, and the rotor was making contact with this post. You can see it was actually physically touching it. I remember, no, this was the one that had a whole bunch of trash in it. And you want to watch this little carbon button in the center too, because that will sometimes break and cause you problems. A lot of people will go to that Pertronics unit to get rid of the points, say it solves all your problems, but in my experience, points are like 1% of the ignition problems that you'll have with these trucks. It's almost always a problem in the cap or in the coil. The coils are a big issue because the Chinese-made coils that you have here are hit and miss where quality is concerned. Sometimes you'll find one that will last for years, and other times you'll get one that's bad right out of the box and never works. So the Pertronics doesn't do anything for that, and a lot of times the people put the Pertronics in and they will neglect the maintenance of the distributor, where you actually have to open the distributor up and put oil in the wick and everything. So Pertronics has its place. It's for trucks that don't really get used, that maybe you see a parade a couple of times a year, so you don't have to worry about the points turning white. This truck gets driven every day of the year round, and points are just not an issue. I adjust them once a year, and gets approximately 6,000 miles on it in a year. So the other thing you want to watch is sometimes your PCV valve will stick, and that causes some really bizarre symptoms. When it really shows up when you're coming out of high speed and you take your foot off the gas, and then when you go to downshift, there's nothing there. What's happened is, if this PCV valve sticks, it kind of makes like a giant vacuum leak underneath your carb. So it causes some really weird symptoms that are kind of hard to track down, and usually just tapping it will free it up, and then you can clean it later when you get home. Sometimes you'll have people say you have vapor lock issues. That's never really been an issue. My old truck, I lived in a place where it got up to about 40 degrees Celsius sometimes in the summer, and vapor lock just never happened. So it had the stock system just as this truck does, so I don't understand why so many people have an issue with that. This heat shield is definitely important. You have to have that in place, and that's there just to keep the heat off of the fuel pump. It's never been a problem with this truck. Sometimes with the ethanol and the gas, you will have percolating fuel. You can actually hear it boiling in the line, but that only happens when the truck is parked and idle. You'll have that happen. It's a little bit difficult to start at that time, but all you really have to do is just pull the hand throttle out when you crank it, and she'll fire right up. It's never been an issue to the point of stopping the truck. And sometimes you'll have a plug will die, so you'll be running on 5 cylinders. That's why you carry a spare plug with you. Most of the time it's not the actual plug itself. There's a little carbon resistor in the top of the plug, which you can remove with a little Phillips screwdriver, and they come out on a spring, and then you can just change the little carbon rod in there, and your plug is as good as new usually. These plugs basically last forever. I take them out and clean them, and I put in a cleaned set, and then the set that I take out will get cleaned and refurbished, re-gapped, and then put into storage, and then I'll swap them out again in a year. I've only done that twice in this truck in 4 years. This is running the same plugs that have been in here for a long time. Sometimes your charging system will go haywire on you. You should always carry a rubber hammer with you to bop the voltage regulator. That usually solves that problem temporarily, and then you can fix it later. Belts. I keep the belt relatively loose. It's a lot easier on the water pump bearings, and on the generator bearings it runs perfectly like that. Makes the belt last a lot longer. You don't have to worry about them wearing out on you. Always keep an eye on your radiator hoses. Make sure you change them when they're starting to look flabby and worn out. Now that's about it. These trucks are really simple. You should have no problem if you know basic mechanics to get these things going. Sometimes the little chain inside the governor will break. That's a bit of a difficult thing to try to fix on the road. So if that happens, you're probably going to be looking for a tow. And it's very, very rare for that to happen, but it can happen. That's about it, I guess.